stop for a second. Just stop. I want you to think about something before we get into this. Think about a time when you gave everything, your time, your attention, your energy, to someone you genuinely cared about. You were there when she needed you. You answered every message. You changed your plans for her. You put her first, consistently, without being asked. And somewhere along the way, without any big fight, without any dramatic moment, she just started pulling away. The calls got shorter. The replies got slower. Something changed. And no matter how much more you gave, it just kept getting worse. If that sounds familiar, stay with me. Because today, I want to talk about why that happens, not the surface level stuff you heard 100 times. But the real reason? The psychological reason. And I'm going to use the work of a man who figured this out 500 years ago. In a completely different context, and yet got it more right than most modern relationship advice ever will. That man was Niccolò Machiavelli. He lived in Florence in the 1500s. He was a diplomat, a political thinker, and eventually a writer. His most famous work, The Prince, was so controversial when it was published that it was banned in several places. Rulers read it privately and never admitted it publicly. The church condemned it. And yet powerful men kept it close. Why? Because Machiavelli didn't write what was polite. He didn't write what people wanted to hear. He wrote what was actually true about human nature, how people behave, what they respond to, what they truly value versus what they say they value. He understood something that most people in his time, and honestly most people today, still refuse to accept. People are not primarily moved by kindness. They are moved by perception of value, by scarcity, by emotional tension, and by the presence of someone who has genuine control over themselves. Now, before you switch off, this is not about being cold. It's not about playing games. What I'm going to share with you today isn't a manipulation strategy. It's actually the opposite. It's about understanding yourself well enough that you stop accidentally destroying the very things you want to build. Let's start with the first principle, because this one is the foundation of everything else: scarcity. Machiavelli understood that value and availability are inversely related. Think about anything in your life: a restaurant that always has tables available versus one that's booked 3 weeks out, a product that's always in stock versus one that sells out. Your brain automatically assigns more value to the thing that feels harder to get. Not because you're being irrational, but because scarcity is a signal. It signals quality. It signals that other people want it too. It signals that if you don't act, you might miss it. And this works in the same way with people. When you are endlessly available, when there is no possibility of missing you, because you are always, whether you might get busy, whether you might simply not be there one day. And without that uncertainty, without that slight tension, the attraction quietly dies. I want to be very clear here because I know how this sounds. I'm not telling you to ignore people you care about or manufacture distance that isn't real. Have your friendships, your interests, your routines that exist completely independently of any relationship. Stop double texting when you don't get a reply. Stop canceling your plans every time she's free, not because you're trying to seem mysterious, but because you actually have a life worth living. They start being deliberately cold. And then they wonder why it backfired. Because scarcity without emotional stability is just immaturity in a trench coat. And that brings us to the second principle: emotional stability. This one is harder to talk about because it requires real honesty, readable, and most importantly, controllable by others. The moment someone figures out exactly which button to push to get a reaction from you, they have power over you. If she knows that a certain kind of silence from her will make you anxious, and she has seen it happen, even if she is not doing it intentionally. If she knows that a certain tone, a certain look, a certain distance will cause you to chase, and predictability is the death of tension. What emotional stability actually looks like in practice is quieter than people expect. It's the pause before you respond to something that upsets you. It's the ability to sit with a feeling without immediately acting on it. It's not mirroring her mood. If she's distant and cold, you're not becoming desperate and warm to compensate. You stay level. You stay yourself. This doesn't mean you don't feel things. It means your feelings don't drive every decision you make. And the difference between those two things, feeling something and being run by it. The difference between a man who commands respect and a man who constantly needs to be managed. Because here's the thing: when you meet someone who genuinely excites you, it is a natural human response to idealize them a little bit. To put them slightly above yourself in your own mind. To treat every moment with them as slightly precious, slightly fragile, something to be protected. And while that feeling is real, and it's understandable acting on it, letting it drive your behavior, that is where things start to collapse. When you put someone on a pedestal, a few things happen simultaneously. First, you stop being honest. You agree with things you don't actually agree with. You laugh at things you don't actually find funny. You soften your opinions, your preferences, your personality, because somewhere inside, you've decided that the real you might not be enough. Second, the dynamic shifts. Attraction requires some degree of polarity to people who are both grounded, both secure, both standing on their own. The moment one person is clearly above the other in the relationship's emotional economy, the tension dissolves. And the third thing, and this one is the hardest to accept, is that she can feel it. Women are extraordinarily perceptive about this. She can feel when you're editing yourself for her approval. She can feel when your validation is coming from her rather than from within yourself. And paradoxically, the more you try to please her from that place of insecurity, the less appealing you become. The practical shift here is not complicated, but it does require some courage. Disagree with her sometimes. Calmly, respectfully, but actually disagree. Have opinions. Hold your ground when challenged on something you genuinely believe. Tease her a little. Be comfortable enough with yourself to be playful rather than careful. And most importantly, have standards. If something she does is not okay with you, say so. Without anger, without drama, without a lecture. Just clearly. I'm not okay with that. That's it. The message it sends is more powerful than any strategy you could plan. It says that you value yourself. And people are drawn to people who value themselves. The fourth principle is one that modern culture has almost completely forgotten. Silence. We have become a generation of over-explainers. Everything needs a justification. Every decision needs context. Every boundary needs a 3-paragraph explanation of why you feel the way you feel. And this comes from a good place. We want to be understood. We want the other person to know where we're coming from. But what it actually communicates, at a deeper level, is that you need their approval. That you cannot simply act from your own judgment and trust that to be enough. Machiavelli noticed this about leaders too. The ones who explained every decision at length were the ones who seemed most uncertain. Because a man who is genuinely secure in his choices doesn't need to sell them. He makes them, he stands behind them, and he moves on. Think about the most respected, the most quietly powerful people you've encountered in your life. They weren't the ones who talked the most. They were the ones whose words, when they came, meant something. They didn't chase every conversation. They didn't react to every provocation. They didn't feel compelled to fill every silence. And that composure, that willingness to simply be, without performing, it draws people in. In practice, this means giving shorter responses when a shorter response is actually more honest. It means not justifying your no with a 5-minute explanation. It means sitting comfortably in a moment of silence, rather than rushing to break it. It means when someone pushes back on a decision you've made, your answer can simply be, "That's what I felt was right," and then you move on. This takes practice because the anxiety is real. The pull to explain yourself, to be understood, to smooth everything over, that's a deeply human instinct. But every time you resist it, every time you choose composure over reassurance seeking, you become a little more grounded. And groundedness is one of the most underrated, attractive qualities a person can have. And now the fifth principle, the one that brings everything together and is also the one most people are most afraid to actually apply, the willingness to walk away. Let me be careful with what I mean here, because this one gets misunderstood. I'm not talking about being cold. I'm not talking about threatening to leave as a tactic. I'm not talking about manufacturing drama to make someone worried. What I'm talking about is something internal, a genuine freedom from the outcome. Neediness has a texture. You can feel it in a conversation before anyone has said anything explicitly. When someone is desperately invested in a particular outcome, when their self-worth is riding on whether this particular person chooses them, that energy is palpable. And it does the opposite of what the person intends. Instead of creating closeness, it creates pressure. And pressure, in relationships, creates distance. Machiavelli wrote about rulers who were so desperate to avoid conflict that they would make any concession, accept any terms, just to preserve peace in the short term. And he wrote that those rulers always lost in the long term. Because when you make it clear that you will tolerate anything rather than walk away from the table, the other side stops respecting the table. The same principle applies here. When you stay in situations that don't serve you, when you accept behavior that you've told yourself you won't accept, when you keep showing up for someone who has repeatedly shown you that they do unvalue your presence, you are communicating something. You are saying that you have no other options. And when someone believes you have no other options, they stop treating you like a priority. The shift happens when you build a life so full, so genuinely engaging, so grounded in your own sense of purpose that any particular relationship, as much as you might want it, is not the only thing standing between you and a meaningful existence. When you have that, when you actually have that, not as a performance but as a reality, your energy changes completely. You stop chasing. You start simply being present with what's good and honest about walking away from what isn't. And ironically, that freedom, that genuine non-desperation, is one of the most magnetic things a person can carry. Now I want to bring this to a close with something important. Because everything I've talked about today, the scarcity, the emotional control, the self-respect, the silence, the willingness to walk away, all of it flows from one source. And that source is mastery, not mastery over someone else. Not mastery over a situation. Mastery over yourself. Your impulses, your reactions, your need for approval, your fear of being alone, your tendency to shrink, yourself to keep someone comfortable. That is the work. And it is genuinely difficult work. It's much harder than any technique or tactic. Because techniques you can memorize. This requires you to actually change, to sit with discomfort, to act from your values even when your emotions are pulling you in another direction, to choose long-term self-respect over short-term relief. Machiavelli understood something about power that gets lost in the casual summaries of his work. The Prince wasn't really about controlling others. It was about understanding human nature clearly enough that you stop being controlled by your own blind spots. The man who knows himself, who understands his fears, his weaknesses, his patterns, that man is harder to manipulate, harder to destabilize, harder to diminish. And he is, by that same quality, naturally compelling to be around. Because when someone is genuinely grounded in themselves, you feel it. It's not about what they say or what they do. It has something in how they carry themselves. A kind of quiet certainty. And that is what you're actually building when you do this work. Not a persona, not a strategy, an actual self, one that you've chosen deliberately, rather than one that formed around other people's expectations of you. So here is what I'll leave you with. Stop trying to win people over with your availability. Stop shrinking yourself to make someone comfortable. Stop explaining yourself to people who've already decided how they see you. Build your life. Build it around your values, your purpose, your own sense of what makes a day worth living. Get so invested in your own growth that a relationship enhances your life rather than defines it. Get honest about the things you're tolerating that you shouldn't be. Get quiet enough on the inside that you stop needing external noise to feel okay. And when you do all of that, genuinely, not as a performance, the right people will notice. Because you will have become the kind of person who is worth noticing. Not because you followed a set of rules, but because you actually became someone worth respecting. Starting with yourself. If this landed with you today, if you understand that this was never about controlling anyone, and that it was always about controlling yourself, comment one word below. That word is discipline. Because that's what separates the men who talk about this from the men who actually live it.